This was back in high school. I grew up in a small town. Everyone went through the same elementary and high school. We all kind of knew each other's business to some extent. I had this guy who had been annoying me for a couple years, but it wasn't a lot. Mostly because he wasn't the brightest, so it wasn't uncommon that I got him back with a reply that he couldn't answer to. One day, I think it was the 11th grade, he said something rather mean to me, but I answered back and a bunch of people all laughed at him. He got really red in the face, and then he leaned in real close and made a vile sexual threat. Then he walked away with a big grin on his face. That really pissed me off for obvious reasons. I thought about the interaction all day, and after school, I decided what to do about it. I went and told his mom. Up until that day, all of our clashes had been the usual high school nonsense. Some shove in the hallway, some comment meant to sting, me firing back with a sharper reply. But this time was different. The way he leaned in, the look in his eyes, and that ugly sentence he spat out left me sick to my stomach. It wasn't just another insult. It was something designed to make me feel small, to scare me, to remind me I was a girl, and he thought he had power over me. I kept turning it over in my mind during class. Teachers were talking, chalk scratching against boards, but all I could hear was his voice and see that stupid grin. For the first time, I didn't just want to clap back. I wanted him to actually face consequences. That's when the idea hit me. We lived in a town where parents still knew what their kids were doing, where moms could straighten you out faster than any teacher or principal. I realized there was someone who needed to hear about this more than anyone else, his mom. So after school, instead of heading home, I walked straight to his house. My heart was pounding the entire way. I wasn't even sure if I'd go through with it until I was standing at their front door. The porch light was off, the blinds half open, and I could smell someone baking from inside. I knocked before I could change my mind. She opened the door, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel, looking surprised but not unfriendly. I told her who I was and that I went to school with her son. That was all it took. She stepped aside and let me in. We sat in their living room, me stumbling over my words at first, then finally blurting everything out. The comments, the constant harassment, and then what he said that day. The more I spoke, the quieter she became. By the time I repeated the threat, she was staring at the floor, her face pale, her knuckles white around the towel she was still holding. And then the door opened. He walked in, tossing his backpack down and calling for her. The second he saw me sitting there, he froze. Confusion flickered across his face, then recognition, then the realization of exactly why I was there. She didn't waste any time. She called him over, sat him down, and asked if what I said was true. He tried to laugh it off, deny it, but she cut him off sharp. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was firm in a way that made the air heavy. For the next 10 minutes, I witnessed something I'll never forget. A mother laying down the law with absolute clarity. She told him she was ashamed, that this behavior was disgusting, that he was lucky it was only me telling her and not the police or a teacher. She took his newly earned driver's license right out of his wallet, told him his privileges were gone, and handed down a punishment that made even me raise my eyebrows. He'd be writing an essay about his actions, over and over until it was right. When she was done, she sent him to his room without another word. Then she grabbed her car keys and offered me a ride home. I got in, still stunned by what I'd just seen, and from that day on, he never so much as looked at me again. Not once. The next day at school, I showed up with the same notebooks and the same ponytail, but inside, everything was different. I walked to my locker and found myself waiting for him to show up. Things fly apart quickly in a small town, and I knew he'd already figured out that the secret wasn't a secret. And sure enough, he showed up. He was walking down the hall with the same friends, wearing the same stretched-out t-shirt, but his stride was different. Usually he acted like the entire hallway belonged to him. Loud jokes, elbows out, staring straight at me. This time he was quieter. I was standing by my locker getting a textbook, and I felt him approach. In the past, he would have probably said something. "Hey, princess, what are you messing around with?" Or just nudged me with his shoulder. But he walked by in silence, eyes on the floor, step even, not a word. The first silence is always louder than any insult. I noticed his buddies glance at each other, as if they were expecting his usual show. But there was no show. In class, he also became quieter. The teachers might not have noticed, but we, classmates, saw everything. He didn't interrupt, didn't shout, didn't look for another victim with his eyes. He sat and pretended to write. At first, I thought he was playing, that he was waiting for the right moment to take revenge. But the days went by and nothing happened. Of course, rumors started to spread. At our school, if one person noticed something unusual, everyone would know about it 3 breaks later. No one said anything directly, but I heard snippets of conversations. And his mom made a scene. You deprived him of his license, can you imagine? As soon as he got it, that's it, she took it away. He's writing some essay about how he's an asshole. They said it in a whisper, as if they were afraid he would hear. But it was as if he wasn't listening. He sat in the dining room, picked at his food, and didn't look at anyone. Sometimes I caught his gaze from afar. It wasn't angry, it wasn't threatening, more empty. Like he could still hear his mother's voice. And honestly, it worked better than any fight. He became his own shadow. It was a strange feeling for me. On the one hand, I was happy. No one was bothering me, no one was tugging at me. I could walk down the corridor without expecting to be tripped or joked about. On the other hand, I was wary inside. It seemed too easy, but the consequences were loud, just not for me, but for him. His mother really wasn't kidding. He handed in his driver's license the very next day. The car he bragged about was left parked outside the house. On Saturdays, when I walked down their street, I saw him washing it, but not getting behind the wheel himself. For a teenager in our town, this was worse than house arrest. And then there was this essay. During the break, I heard one guy say to another, "Can you imagine? He's rewriting it for the third time, and she keeps tearing it up and making him do it all over again." I don't know if it's true or not, but the image of him sitting at the table, writing an apology, and his mother standing over him with a red pen seemed like a small but precise justice. At school, he kept to himself, and I realized he wasn't afraid of me. He was afraid of her. It was a new discovery. Sometimes the most terrifying force isn't a fist or a crowd of friends, but a voice in your home that won't tolerate your shit. And every time he passed by without looking up, I felt that the decision I made that day was the right one. The weeks dragged on, and the silence around him became the new norm. The first few days, I caught myself constantly on guard, waiting for a trick in the hallway, a glance over my shoulder, a note in my locker. Nothing. He passed by as if he were an empty wall. At some point, I realized it became easier for me to breathe. Not because he was gone, but because he stopped occupying a place in my head that he never had a right to. In a small town, news isn't so much told as pieced together. One piece came from Kate, who lived on the street next to his and on her way to practice would see their kitchen. Lights on late, him at the table, hunched over a notebook, probably writing an essay. She shrugged. The other piece came from Josh, who worked part-time for the pastor. On Saturdays, the guy helped carry boxes of old books and children's clothes at the church fair. Voluntarily? Josh chuckled. Yeah, voluntary mom style. The third piece was the most telling. I was walking from the library and saw him with my mom at the DMV. He was holding an envelope, and she was talking to the employee, nodding too seriously. We made eye contact for a split second, and he immediately looked away. I realized that the license story wasn't just she took the card from her wallet. She had formalized it the way adults formalize obligations, officially for a period with marks. At our age, this was perceived almost as a legend, but it was a simple administrative reality. Lost a habit, get a new habit of responsibility. At the same time, strange work was going on inside me. I was catching two opposing forces inside me. Relief, they left me alone, and anger, which was in no hurry to go away. Anxiety doesn't just turn off with a click, it needs time. At a meeting with our school counselor, I finally said out loud everything that was stuck in a lump, both about the threat and about the feeling of sticky shame, although it wasn't me who was ashamed. The counselor listened attentively, wrote down some words, I think boundaries, safety, validate, and in the end said very simply, you did the right thing. This is an adult way of conveying the truth where it will be heard. Sometimes it's precisely these sentences that unravel the knots. They continued to whisper about him, but the whispers changed their tone. If earlier they had called him cool, brave, impudent, now they were saying simpler words, overdid it, disgraced himself. His buddies moved to other tables. During breaks, he stood by the window, drank from a plastic bottle, and pretended not to see anyone. And this pretending was unexpectedly more honest than all his cheap grins before. One day, on my way out of school, I bumped into his mother outside the supermarket. She was carrying a bag of milk and apples, saw me, and stopped. I braced myself for a stiff hello, and she said, "Thank you for coming then." No unnecessary words, no excuses. I should have known, she added quietly. I nodded, not because I had forgiven and forgotten, but because acknowledging a fact is also a step. She moved on, and I stood in front of the door, catching myself thinking something strange. Sometimes an adult on their side is just an adult who calls a spade at home. There were legends about the essay. Someone claimed that he rewrote it 5 times. Someone's mother read it aloud and made him look for specifics. Not I was wrong, but I tried to humiliate a person in order to feel power. Someone saw a dictionary with bookmarks in their kitchen. I heard this and thought, perhaps for the first time in his life, he is trying to understand the meaning, not the justification. One small episode finally switched me from waiting for danger to observing reality. Voluntary assistance to the younger ones began in the gym. I saw him in the hall with the younger girls who were learning to serve the ball. He silently set up their racks, showed them how to hold the wrist. No jokes, no crown. The coach even patted him on the shoulder. I caught myself looking straight ahead, not hiding, and I felt no fear. If this was part of his corrective work, so be it. If it was something human, even more so. The main thing is that he stopped being a threat. Of course, I didn't contact him, much less talk to him. I didn't need his version of sorry. I wasn't looking for closure through his speech. My closure was in something else. The right to walk down the hallway without looking away, to laugh loudly at my desk, to answer guys the way I wanted, not to explain to anyone why I was no longer silent. And this right was returning to me with each passing day, with a confident, calm gait. In the spring, we were taking a literature test. I was sitting in the 3rd row by the window and suddenly caught someone looking at me. Not him, but the teacher. She smiled and nodded slightly, then walked down the rows and stopped at him. She put a sheet of paper with printed text on the table and said, "You can format this as an essay for the school magazine if you like." He nodded. I don't know what was on that sheet of paper, and I don't have to know, but the fact that the adults gave him the opportunity to turn punishment into an experience seemed right to me. And safe, because it happened under supervision. Sometimes I get asked, by friends who knew only in whispers, "Don't you regret going to his mom? Maybe you should have left everything as it was." Leaving means living the rest of school in fear. Responding symmetrically means getting sucked into a game where he had more resources. But going to a place where his authority turns into responsibility was an adult decision. And I'm proud of that girl in sneakers who trembled at someone else's door and knocked anyway. By May, he still didn't drive. In the evening, a soft light would burn in the windows of their house, and I seemed to hear the creak of a chair and the rustle of paper. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I wanted to believe that each rewritten word took away from him a piece of that viscous confidence that I can do anything, and returned something resembling the understanding that no, you can't. Our graduation was ordinary. Balloons, cords on caps, parents with cameras. I don't look for dramatic endings. A slamming door, tears, chants. My ending happened earlier in an empty school corridor when I was walking to chemistry for the first time after all this history with a textbook and caught myself on a simple feeling I'm not afraid. And everything else, his rights, his essays, his silence, was already his path. And yet small towns love small epilogues. One of them found me later in the summer at a bus stop. But before that, we still have one chapter to go through, about how memory changes when fear stops dictating the terms. Memory is a strange thing. As long as you live inside fear, it is like sticky tape. Everything that confirms your anxiety sticks to it. As soon as the fear weakens, the tape suddenly stops clinging to trifles. In the spring, I caught myself remembering not his words, but my steps in the empty corridor, a sunny spot on the floor, a heavy silence in which I was not afraid. This was my after. Our graduation went like everyone else's. Rehearsals, laughter in the gym, memory playing on the radio, moms with cameras, dads with iron calm. I followed my letter, adjusted the ribbon on my robe, and thought about something simple. No matter what they said on stage about new horizons, my main horizon had already happened. I had regained the right to walk down the corridors without looking back. On stage, the director gave a speech about kindness and respect. Someone even rolled their eyes. Too pompous. But I stood and listened because now I understood. Sometimes these words are not empty. Sometimes they become action. He sat 3 rows away. I saw his profile. Calm, focused, as if he had decided that evening to simply be part of the whole. Not a single ostentatious gesture. When the audience applauded, he clapped along with everyone else and did not look for the audience with his eyes. Maybe this was a new role. Or maybe he was really tired of the old one. Afterwards, we took pictures by the steps. His mother came up to me. She didn't hug me, didn't try to talk at length. She just said, "Thank you again." "I hope you'll forget about us quickly," I answered honestly. "I don't want to forget. I want to remember correctly." She nodded, and that was probably the best dialogue between grown women, which we each were in our own way at that moment. Summer in a small town is always a slow movie. Melted asphalt, the creaking of swings, long twilight, the road to the river. I settled in a cafe on the corner where it smelled of vanilla and ice. In the morning, children scurried about for ice cream. In the afternoon, workers came for lemonade. In the evening, old people for pie. I loved this rhythm. There was something calming about it, like a pulse that finally beats evenly. Sometimes he would pass by, always on foot, sometimes with a shopping bag, sometimes in a school team t-shirt which he seemed to have stopped wearing defiantly. He would pass by, nodding to someone he knew, but not to me. And this, not to me, was correct. Boundaries are not discussed, they are respected. By midsummer, I noticed my memory changing. If before any of his silhouettes turned me into a taut string, now it didn't. I saw just a guy from our class. Not a threat, not a source of whispers, but a person whose actions had once hurt me and for which he had received a response. From the particular, he became the general. From the general, the background. And this was my small triumph. I stopped being the heroine of someone else's story. August turned into a short heat wave and thunderstorms. One evening, when a thick, almost viscous darkness descended on the city, I missed the bus. The station was half empty. A fan was blowing warm air, and cicadas were chirping somewhere in the distance. I sat on the edge of a bench, scrolled through the news feed, and looked up. He was standing at the opposite end of the stop, not next to me, not across from me. At a distance, as if he remembered his lessons as well as I did. We were silent. The minutes stretched out like chewing gum. I debated whether I should say anything. I didn't want to talk. Not for closure, not for generosity, not for a let's be friends that would never happen. But pretending he was a nobody didn't feel right either. We both knew what had happened between us, and we both knew how it ended. He spoke first, without getting up or taking a single step closer. "I know you don't need to, but I'll tell you I was wrong. Then, and many times before." The voice was even, without the usual mockery, without the blurred sorry. Just a fact. I looked at him, not as a judge but as a person who does what he should have done himself without prompting. And I answered, "I hear." I didn't say, "I forgive you." I didn't say it's okay, because it's not, but I said the main thing. I hear you. He nodded. The air between us didn't get warmer or commit to getting warmer. It just stopped being tense. His bus pulled up, he got in without looking back. For a second, my reflection overlapped in the glass, and I thought, this is what growing up must be like. Not looking for a winner, not watching for signs of revenge, just letting the story end without starting a new one. The next day, the youngest girl from our school, Lily, ran into the cafe. She blew a strand of hair from her forehead and chattered. Did you really tell his mom? And did she really take away his license? And did he really rewrite the essay? I smiled and poured her a lemonade. I didn't hurt him, I said. I made sure my boundaries were visible, and that adults would see what was happening. Lily thought for a moment and quietly said, if someone touches me, I'll tell them too. I nodded. Let this chain remain in our city. Not keep quiet and endure, but speak where you will be heard. By September, we had gone our separate ways. Some to college, some to work, some to stay for now. I left with a suitcase and the feeling that I no longer had any debts in this city. As we said goodbye, we walked around the school. I ran my palm over the cold surface of my locker, looked at the t-shirt with the logo in the trophy case, and caught myself smiling. Not nostalgic, light, like at the end of a good movie without unnecessary credits. I never saw him again. Sometimes names from our class would pop up on social media, likes on photos of other people's children, greetings from distant states. His name never popped up, and that was okay. Not all stories have to continue. Some honestly end where they're supposed to, at an empty evening bus stop, in 2 sentences that don't require a sequel. Sometimes I get asked about revenge. I always answer differently, but the meaning is the same. It's not revenge. It's restoring balance. Because revenge is when you want the other person to be hurt as much as you were. And justice is when you want things to be safe from now on. For yourself, for others, for those who are younger and weaker. I chose the latter, and maybe that's why the summer after was not about I won, but about I'm free. At university, I first heard the word boundaries not as an abstraction, but as a practice. At freshman orientation, a psychologist put 3 short phrases on a slide. Speak clearly, look for adults who have authority, record the facts. I caught myself smiling. Strangely, my school revenge was exactly that. Not a fist or a loud scandal, but a route from fear to structure. In my first years, I decided to join a student group that supported peers. A hotline, escorts to a supervisor, help with applications. We taught simple things: how to record a conversation immediately after an episode, how to describe actions rather than guesses, how not to let yourself be devalued with phrases like, stop being dramatic. Sometimes girls would come and say in a half whisper, it's probably bullshit. He's just joking. And I always answered the same way. If you're scared and uncomfortable, it's not bullshit. They would raise their eyes and nod, as if they were finally allowed to feel what they were already feeling. I rarely talked about my school story, not because I was afraid. I just didn't want to replace other people's experiences with my biography. But once, at a workshop, I was asked to give an example of escalation without violence. I took a breath and briefly recounted that day. The hallway, his smirk, my path to their house, the kitchen with the smell of baking, his mother's calm voice, a plastic card on the table, the word essay. The audience became very quiet. Someone asked, weren't you afraid that things would get worse for him at home? I honestly said, I was afraid, but I knew that things had already gotten worse for me. I had to do better, at least for myself, and for those who would come after. This answer was later quoted in our booklets. Then there's work. In the corporate world, boundaries are often hidden behind badges and calendars. Meeting at 9, report by evening. Let's discuss it on the go. I've seen borderline jokes become the norm if you don't call them by their names. There was a guy in our department who liked to tease an intern. Oh, come on, honey, can you handle this? The first time, I pretended not to hear. The second time, I went up to him after a planning meeting and calmly said, don't do that anymore. This isn't a joke, it's belittling competence. He rolled his eyes. The third time, I wrote down the quote and time and sent a note to HR. No pathos, just facts. A week later, he disappeared from calls, and at a general meeting, a new feedback policy was announced. I felt a familiar aftertaste. This isn't revenge. This is prevention. Once a year, I returned to our town, to my parents, to the river, to the same swings that had been creaking, I think, since my elementary school. And one day I found myself at a class reunion I didn't really want to go. I like people individually, not in crowds, but my friend pulled me out. Let's go for an hour. Let's see who's bald and who's with kids. We entered the assembly hall, which smelled of parquet varnish and PTA pies, and I saw him right away. Not because I was looking for him, but because he was standing in profile next to the trophy stand, still in the same team colors, only now on someone else's shoulders in the photo. He was talking to someone, smiling, an ordinary human smile, not the one from the corridors. He noticed me almost immediately. We nodded to each other briefly, like neighbors on a bus. He didn't come over, and I didn't come over. And that was the most correct, right thing to do. 20 minutes later, I went outside. It was easier to breathe in the twilight. I stood on the porch and looked at the field where his friends had once shouted the loudest, their elbows touching my shoulders. Children in bright t-shirts were running around on the field. Someone was laughing so loudly that everything inside me became strangely even. Growing up, I thought, is when you can stand in the same place and feel not triumph, but space. After some time, a classmate I hadn't seen since graduation wrote to me, "Can you talk to my little sister? She's having an unpleasant situation at school, and her parents are saying, don't get worked up." We met at a cafe where they served sticky lemonade in the evenings. The girl spoke quickly and quietly, as if she wanted to say everything before she lost her desire. I listened and took notes: dates, classes, who was nearby. Then we made a list: who to go to, what to say, what phrases would keep her from being zeroed out. She left with a glass of plans, and I caught myself thanking that school me for once taking the truth to where it was heard and learning to repeat this movement. Sometimes I dream of that kitchen, the light above the table, the streak of sundust, his mother with a towel clenched in her fist. In those dreams, she doesn't scream. She asks questions, and that seems to be the most important thing in my memory. What decided the outcome was not rage or punishment, but precise questions and the right to say no. I wake up and think that if I ever have a child, there will be 3 pillars of raising him. You have the right to be safe, your words matter, and we will always find an adult who has authority and responsibility. I think about him less and less, not because he disappeared, but because he is no longer an anchor in my story. Sometimes mutual acquaintances flash in my feed. Someone got married, someone moved, someone opened a car repair shop. I once saw a photo from a charity fair. He is standing at a tent with books, holding a box, next to a sign for gym renovation. I scrolled further and thought that justice does not need to turn into an eternal sentence. It is enough for it to put things in their place once. And yet, I made one missing gesture much later, when I was already working and was invited to speak at my school's career day. I walked down a familiar hallway, the same one where I once feared being set up at my locker, and led a class of 20 teenagers through my presentation on first job, first mistakes, and the right to say no. At the end, one girl raised her hand. "What do you do if there's a guy at school who gets away with something?" I took a deep breath and answered very simply, to make it stop being his and yours story and become an adult task for the school, not to be left alone. And remember, telling the truth is not snitching, it's fixing the system. After class, the head teacher came up to me. There was recognition in her gaze, the kind that doesn't need names or details. She said, "Thank you for calling things by their proper names. We need that more often." And at that moment, I realized that the circle had truly closed. Not on his apology or my forgiveness, but on the fact that now someone else would have a less scary path down the hallway. Several more years have passed since then. I have learned to quickly recognize situations where instead of a joke, there is a whiff of power, and I have a proven algorithm. Name it, write it down, take it to where people have the authority to respond. Sometimes they tell me, "Well, these are trifles." And I answer, "Trifles are the building blocks of habit. They are used to build either safe walls or labyrinths where voices get lost." I choose the former, and if someday at another alumni meeting we again exchange short nods, it will be simply a gesture of 2 adults who once did difficult things. One answered for his actions, the other took the truth to where it became a deed. Years later, I visited my hometown for a couple of days. I was walking through the supermarket looking for cereal for my mother when I saw her. Her hair had turned gray, but her posture was the same. She was pushing a cart and stopped near the dairy section. I froze, not knowing whether to approach her, but she noticed me first. She smiled quietly and said, "You've changed. For the better, I hope," I replied. "In a strong way," she corrected. We didn't talk about the past directly, but in her eyes, I saw what had happened then, many years ago. Firmness and a willingness to listen. And I realized that in this story, the main character is not only me. Without her, everything could have ended completely differently. We said goodbye with a short, "Take care," and I left the store with ease, as if I had put the final period on a sentence that had been left open for too long. When I tell this story now, I call it not revenge, but a lesson. Because revenge is about wanting pain for someone else, and a lesson is about wanting change. He learned his lesson. I learned it too. I learned to tell the truth and trust adults who can intervene. I learned to distinguish justice from revenge, and every time I see a girl or a boy who is afraid to say, "I was offended," I remember that first road to someone else's house, and I say, "You don't have to endure." Sometimes these words are enough to change the trajectory of an entire life.